Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Boring AppSec podcast. In this episode, we are super excited to welcome Vibhav Sreekanti. Vibhav is the founder and CTO of Profit Security, where he is leading the development of an AI SOC analyst for security operations. With a career focused on startups, Vibhav was most recently VP of Engineering at StackRox, a Kubernetes native security platform that was acquired by Red Hat in 2021. Prior to that, he was part of the team that built Oracle's public cloud OCI, where he led the object storage service and later managed the security products portfolio. Vibhav holds a degree in computer science from Carnegie Mellon University, bringing both academic and practical expertise to his work in AI. In this episode, Vibhav and I discuss the evolving landscape of AI in cybersecurity, the skepticism around generative AI, and the importance of experimentation with AI agents. Vibhav shares insights on building specialized agents for security operations, the challenges of deploying AI in production, and the critical need for security in AI infrastructure. We explore the importance of centralized authentication, the need for human oversight in AI applications, and the lessons learned from Vibhav's startup journey. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Welcome, Vibhav. Super happy to have you here.
Thanks so much, Anshuman. I really appreciate the opportunity and super excited to speak with you.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to add to that introduction, Vibhav?
No, that was great. It's a very kind introduction. Thank you. I would just say I've, for better or for worse, I've spent my career at startups. This is the fourth startup that I've been a part of. I've been an early employee, been a founder, been a part of the management team, more recently, angel investor. So I really love this journey of going from 0 to 1, building a product, building a team, working with customers. It's hard work. I haven't found the easy button just yet, but I really enjoy it and super excited to chat with you.
Yeah, that's awesome. So considering that, you've been through a few startups already, and this is, I believe you said the fourth startup. And based on my research on Profit Security, I believe Profit Security is one of the first companies that is tackling the security problems using AI agents, right? Especially the like automating the SOC analysis, right? So, since you've been building Profit Security for the past couple of years, what has that been like in this evolving landscape of generative AI technologies and the speed at which things are changing and improving on a daily basis? How do you keep up with everything?
Yeah, it's hard. I'm skeptical of anyone who says they know everything that's going on. It's such a fast moving space. I think for better or for worse, Anshuman, it starts with Twitter. Twitter is just incredibly useful for keeping up with what's going on, staying in the loop. Just yesterday, I believe OpenAI announced their predictive output support. I don't know if you saw this, but it's a way for you to reduce latency in your API calls to GPT. And, my best understanding of that feature is it's based on some of the research around speculative decoding that was published last year. And super exciting feature, obviously something that I think everyone, including us, is excited about. Not a lot of detail just yet, and there's just discussion on Twitter, and one of the OpenAI engineers themselves is answering questions about the feature. So I just think, everything is happening on Twitter, and I've just learned so much from being on Twitter and following the right folks. The other thing that's interesting is just, the fact that you can only glean so much, I think, from reading papers. Don't get me wrong, they're important. But to me, I just love, being hands-on, playing with new products and tools. There's just this Cambrian explosion happening outside of security across every industry where everyone is thinking about how do we leverage, these foundational models in our products. Most recently, I think Notebook LM has taken everyone by storm and everyone's really excited about it. So I just think you have to get out there and play with products, feel them, see what folks are doing and see what is applicable to your industry. And maybe the last thing I'll say is you have to keep an open mind. 18 months ago, we were all manually implementing function calling support and probably had a bunch of, bad code around parsing JSON and, making sure that arguments were being specified. And I believe it was June of last year, or maybe it was May, that OpenAI came out with first class function calling support. And all of us got to go delete a bunch of code that we had written. And so I think you have to make sure you're just keeping an open mind and being able to stay up to date to what's going on and be willing to delete some code.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with that. I think so I recently played with OpenAI's Swarm, the AI agentic framework,
Mm.
and even on the GitHub repository it says experimental. So I can understand why they don't want people to use it for production systems, but it was so easy to use, and I was able to build in like an agentic workflow pretty soon, right? So um, and I think. Uh, I would really want more people to sort of go out and experiment with these technologies and frameworks, because unless you do that, right, unless you're waiting for something to be, like production grade, it's not going to happen, right? Especially with newer models coming up, new features coming up. I also, I believe I saw Anthropic came up with this PDF parsing feature sometime last week, where I think, yeah, you can have Anthropic's cloud AI model parse complex architecture diagrams and whatnot, right? Now, yeah, like something like that is very relevant in the application security space, right? Because we have a bunch of technical specification documents and whatnot, and I have played with it, and it's yeah, like parsing complex PDFs is not easy.
No,
So yeah, man, I appreciate that you also have this mindset of going out and playing, and basically not being afraid of revamping the code base altogether, right? Yeah, so that's good to know. So speaking about Gen AI, right? Like I've also seen some folks as skeptical about the speed at which this space is evolving, and also sort of they're not really sure of the value add that it brings to, especially to big enterprise and organizations. Um, what are your thoughts on that, right? Like, do you feel like this skepticism is well informed, or is it mostly because people haven't gone and explored with these technologies?
yeah, as a skeptic myself, I can relate. I totally understand. I'll say there's natural skepticism because there's a long history in the industry of over-promising and under-delivering, whether that be SOAR, UEBA, if you remember that, or even SIM, starting 20, 25 years ago. I have to say that security teams, security practitioners have seen enough of these next big things, and they have every right to be cautious. I also think we can't afford to be Luddites, right? I think skepticism doesn't mean we get to stick our head in the sand. I think ignoring advancements in AI, especially generative AI, is probably a mistake, and I think we could be missing some real solutions to longstanding problems in the industry. I think one area where skepticism is warranted or is important to apply is around bolt-on versus built-in AI. Everything is an AI product these days, and I think folks need to dig a little bit deeper to understand just how AI is being used in different security tools or products. I don't know about you, Anshuman, but I walked the show floor at RSA last year, and every product, every UI, every demo had a little chat panel on the right, and it had like some GPT integration, and they were all calling themselves AI products. AI doesn't mean just having it some sort of chat feature, right? I think you have to think more deeply about how AI is solving the problem. Obviously, I'm biased here. I'm talking my book, but I think if thoughtfully and carefully implemented, Gen AI can improve security operations workflows. I think there is an opportunity to handle repetitive tasks and really help analysts focused on things that matter. But it's important to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's important to ask tough questions. I think if you are approaching this as an opportunity to enhance or augment human capabilities as opposed to trying to replace humans, I think there's an opportunity here where generative AI really makes a difference. But again, not all AI is created equal, so it's really important to ask those questions and try to get one level deeper.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, and speaking about generative AI, right, and your company profit security, I believe you're using AI agents, right? And uh, based on my research and experience, AI agents have just kind of come onto the scene, right, very recently. So have you sort of experimented with different agentic frameworks, right? Like I know there's LangGraph, there's Crew AI, there's Autogen, there's a bunch of other options. And what have those experimentations been like for you? And how do you even decide whether, uh, you know, when to use AI agents versus when you can just simply use like function calling and whatnot? Like how like do you have a framework how do you approach these problems?
Yeah, great question, or great set of questions. We think about these and debate these almost every day internally. I think we've experimented with several, if not all, of the popular frameworks out there. I think they're really fantastic for getting off the ground. You mentioned Swarm a moment ago. Really easy for building something quickly, initial prototypes. Karpathy said that there's a class of problems that are easy to imagine and build demos for, but I think very or extremely difficult to build products out of. And I think that's completely true for agents. These frameworks give you a really fast start, but in our experience, they fall short when you're trying to get the reliability or the control you need to build production grade applications, especially in security, where the bar is really high. I'm reminded of the history of Ruby on Rails, if you're familiar with it. And my understanding of the history is Rails emerged from 37 Signals application called Basecamp, which I think was a project management tool. And they started building Basecamp, and they realized they had built these abstractions and frameworks internally, and they extracted that into Rails. And of course, Rails has turned into this, or has become this mainstay in web application development. And I think, we may see a similar pattern here with agentic frameworks. Rather than trying to come up with the framework ahead of time, something might merge organically out of a successful application. Brett Taylor and Clay Bavor at Sierra have talked about their internal framework. They call it Sierra OS for building their own agentic solutions. I don't know, maybe one day they'll open source Sierra OS and we'll all be using that instead of one of the other ones that you mentioned. For us at Profit Security, we've decided to build our own for sort of the reasons we've talked about. None of the existing solutions quite gave us the observability, the visibility, the control, and the customizability that we felt that we needed for our application. But the team internally hears me say this all the time. I'm not very dogmatic. If we find something better, I'm sure we'll go and use that instead.
Yeah, no. I think building POCs is fine. So, like you said, using some of these frameworks, which is what I've been doing. But then the area that I'm struggling with right now is, how do you take it to the next stage where you can actually deploy it in production and have other users use it? Yes. So, evaluations and consistency and reliability and just kind of chain of thought, right? Like how the AI is thinking and making it more transparent and visible, I think are, at least I believe, in my opinion, are going to be some very hard problems to solve, right? Especially as we start using AI agents in more security-based workflows and whatnot, right? So, do you have any recommendations of sort of what evaluation and what frameworks folks should consider if they were to use some of the open source frameworks like Swarm or Crew AI and whatnot?
Yeah, I think you made a great point earlier that I just want to touch on briefly, and which is around knowing when and when not to use agents. I think it's important to know or use the right tool for the job. Agents and I guess LLMs behind them are stochastic machines. They produce probabilistic outputs, and I think you have to be comfortable with that. There are probably scenarios where you need determinism, and expecting a stochastic process to give you determinism is not very wise. So that it sort of starts there, and knowing where are you comfortable with that determinism or probabilism, I should say. In terms of frameworks, you touched on it yourself earlier. I would say you need or no agentic system is complete without evals, and I think you have to have a very solid understanding of I'll say agentic performance, both in an offline and an online sense. Offline when you're developing the system and trying to understand performance, accuracy, efficacy. What are the metrics are that you're evaluating the agents on? And certainly online, once you put this in production, you have to make sure that the agents are behaving or acting as expected. You of course certainly in our case need to have the ability to make changes if things are not acting or not behaving appropriately. You need the ability to modify production execution. You need the ability to really control these agentic workflows. So I think understanding the use case that you're applying it to, understanding the expectations that your customers have, understanding what are error cases or error scenarios, and your ability to respond to them are probably some questions I would start with asking sort of any generic agentic system.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point about agentic frameworks being more probabilistic, right? Like, yeah, so I think that kind of makes sense because if the use case of what you're trying to solve using agents, if the outcomes are, if you're okay with the outcomes being more probabilistic, then it's okay to use the agentic frameworks versus, you could do something like function calling, which I think kind of gives you more structure around it. Because what I've seen is like if I use an agentic framework and if I deploy multiple agents to solve certain problems, I don't have much control over what the agent is going to do, right? Like, even though I might give it the instruction, the prompt, and whatnot, like I just feel like the agents still have some kind of autonomy to go and do whatever they are asked to do using their own brain. Um, yeah, sometimes I'm scared because the prompts. I think at the end of the day, it's all about the prompts and how concise it is and what is it exactly that you want the agents to do, right? And since I haven't found a good balance, like again, just kind of sharing a hypothetical example, right? Like if we were to think about the security space, right? There are any organization has multiple security teams, right? There's product security, there's incident response, a red team, privacy, legal. And I was thinking maybe if we can build agents that represent each teams to do their things, right? It could work. But then even within teams, right? Like there's so many different kinds of activities that they actually do. So building a generic agent for one particular domain, I don't know. For me at least, I don't think that's a good idea. I think understanding the problem statement and then trying to build an agent around it would probably make more sense. But yeah, no, I'm really excited about this space, and that was one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about was just want to understand how are you approaching solving the SOC analytic like problem, right? Automating that using agents. Like, can you share some of your uh, you know secrets or whatever you can? It's
Yeah, well,
fine.
happy to share more. And I think the challenge is around nomenclature. Sometimes, people may not understand, or there may be a mismatch in what they think of for what is an agent. And, there's some of it is just, uh, you know, in popular dialogue, you might say, oh, I have an agent that does X, that does Y. I have a pen testing agent or a red teaming agent. But in reality, at least from an implementation perspective, Anshuman, I think you end up with far more granular agents, right? Architecturally, you end up with far smaller pieces of responsibility. And you're right that there is a certain amount of autonomy or agency in each one of these components. But I think the smaller or better defined their scope of responsibility is, the more controlled or the more predictable, perhaps, their outcomes or outputs will be. So really, it's not one agent that I think people end up building, but it's a fleet or a combination of agents that have some very specific jobs or responsibilities that they're focused on, and you probably end up with a far more effective outcome. And so when we think about our architecture and we think about the problems we're solving, we have dozens of integrations that we've built. As you well know, every customer may use slightly different tools depending on their security stack. And, part of our job requires us to go and gather evidence, gather data from a variety of these different tools. These are dozens and dozens of agents that we've built for very specific purposes. Some of which might be evidence gathering, some of which might be evidence analysis. And so there are all these tasks that we have to perform in order to help our customers in the incident response or security operations use cases. And so when we think about Prophet AI, it's really a suite of agents. It's not a single monolithic agent per se.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So I'm going to switch gears here slightly, right? So when we think about AI and security, there are two things. There's using AI to solve some of the security problems, and then the other is to actually secure some of these AI initiatives, right?
Yeah.
So as you're building, Profit Security with this suite of agents and whatnot, how are you thinking about securing that infrastructure internally, or if you're using third-party integration and whatnot? Like, have you thought about this, like to the extent that you're confident that the interactions between the agents and the orchestration layer, all of that is secure, or how are you approaching these problems?
Great question. I think it's something that we take seriously. Obviously, we're dealing with fairly sensitive customer data, and so really it's no different, or it starts on a basis that I think you would start with for securing any distributed system. And I think some of the best practices that we've learned over the past couple of decades around infrastructure security apply here too. If anything, agentic architectures are just another form of a distributed system. You can call it a service architecture, a microservice architecture. And so understanding, root of trust, understanding, transport layer security, understanding, mutual authentication and authorization between systems, all of this is applicable to an agentic system, right? It's just another form of distributed system in my personal opinion. And, the fact that it's agentic is just an implementation detail. You can think of distributed systems or service architectures today where you have a database, you have a API server written maybe in Node, you have some sort of backend service written in Ruby or Python. These are just implementation details, right? And we have, a well-defined or best practices for what does security look like in those systems. And I think it's no different agentically. There's maybe another element to this, which you might be asking, and I've certainly heard a lot of our customers ask us about, security of data being sent to hosted model providers, right? What's my data being used for? Is there an inadvertent data leakage possibility here? And I think a lot of customers, rightfully so, are just concerned or asking the tough questions to ensure that they understand what's happening with their data. And so that, I think, takes a slightly different approach. I think you have to be very thoughtful about, if you're using hosted models, what are the hosted model providers doing with that data? Every provider is slightly different. They have different terms and conditions. From a training perspective, there's a lot of effort that we've gone through to make sure that we're very careful about what we train on and what we don't train on. There's some best practices around data anonymization and data masking, which allow us to perhaps give these customers some more comfort that that their data is being handled securely and there isn't inadvertent data leakage that could occur here. So security has multiple elements to it. I'd say starts at the infrastructure level. We certainly eat our own dog food at Prophet Security, so we use Prophet AI to secure our own product. But it goes all the way up the stack, and it has to do with the data that you're ingesting from customer environments, how you're handling that, how you're training on that data, and really what sort of guarantees you're able to provide customers.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing from you is to ask those hard questions to those providers that you plan to use, like OpenAI or Anthropic, whatever. And yeah, no, I think that makes sense because, like if you can't host a model locally, or if you just don't want to deal with, training and like all of the other stuff, then you should be asking all the questions to wherever you're sending the data to, right? Do you feel like, in an infrastructure where essentially you are sending data to, let's say, OpenAI, right? And then you're asking, or maybe you're using something like the function calling to sort of use some of these LLMs capabilities. Do you feel like the outbound traffic also needs to be sort of run through some kind of scanning process where you scan for things like prompt injection attempts or AI going out and whatnot? Do you think like that's a good approach to solve solves for some of these problems? Because I'm asking this because if you do that, you can have some confidence that you're not sending all the sensitive information to OpenAI, right? Yeah. You have some of your processes on your infrastructure as well.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on this?
Totally. Yeah. And I think the short answer is it depends on the use case, right? If you are ingesting free form input from a user, then yes, potentially prompt injection is a concern. And if there's no validation that's happening, application side. And again, there's always been, I think, best practices. Think of OWASP in terms of validation and securing application input. Then I think yes, you may want to do a certain amount of filtering before you go and construct a prompt and send that prompt to a hosted model. On the other side, if the use case is not coming directly from a user, but perhaps your own code or some other integration or system where you have more trust in the input, then maybe that's not as important or as warranted. So I think it makes sense, and some of our customers have what I'll call model gateways that they've deployed, and they want all application traffic to a hosted model provider to go through their model gateway or proxy. Makes sense to us, and if that's where they want to impose policies or restrict access, detect policy violations, I think it's a reasonable approach. Historically, we've had proxies, we've had gateways, not always the most scalable approach. So in the back of my mind, I wonder if this is a short-term or a long-term solution. Does policy need to be enforced centrally, or can it be enforced in a more distributed fashion? We thought a lot about this somewhat, in our past lives at StackRox, where we built a policy engine for Kubernetes environments, and there were some competitors out there that did central policy enforcement, and we thought it was a more scalable approach to go distributed. So I do think about the trade-offs there between distributed and central, but I think gateways are a reasonable starting point, and if that's what helps some of our customers get more comfortable with generative AI and still take advantage of it, then I say that's fine. Everyone has to do what they have to do.
Yeah. When you referring to OPA or Open Policy Agent, yeah. I've played with OPA as well. Yeah, I think the whole idea of centralized sort of authentication, authorization, what have you, using something like OPA is very compelling, right? But I think every organization is different, right? Like, so okay, got it. That makes sense. So speaking about SOAR platforms, right? And for those who are not aware of SOAR, I'll just kind of it's security, orchestration, automation, and response. So Profit Security is actually trying to solve some of these problems that they've observed in the SOAR space, right? So of all the different security domains, right? Like we spoke about AppSec, infrastructure security. What made you sort of start a company on solving this problem in the SOAR space? Like, what did you see there that really drove towards this?
Yeah, it's funny. I would say that we heard this problem from our customers at StackRox that, hey, StackRox generates too many alerts, right? Like, I don't know what to do with all of these. And I sometimes joke that, we started this company to really repent for our sins. We were part of the problem, Anshuman, if I'm honest with you. And StackRox was certainly guilty of generating too many alerts. Whenever we were in doubt, we erred on more alerts, not less. But as the average, incident response or security operations team is just inundated by alerts. We call it alert fatigue. There are all sorts of names for it. But it's been a long-standing problem, and I don't think we've really had a great opportunity or a great solution or answer to this problem for many years. You mentioned SOAR earlier, and 10, 12 years ago, SOAR came out as a potential, answer to this, and certainly a lot of promises were made. I think in retrospect, SOAR failed. I don't think SOAR quite lived up to its expectations. Different analysts now describe SOAR as just obsolete. One of the really main challenges with SOAR, in my opinion, is the fact that automation isn't something you can build once and forget about. It's, environments are constantly changing, constantly evolving, and therefore SOAR workflows need constant maintenance. And from my perspective, very few security teams have the resources or bandwidth to really dedicate to this. I think SOAR ends up being very focused on specific predefined actions, like resetting credentials or isolating a host, well-defined. They're straightforward. You have predictability, almost rules-based. You can trust SOAR to go and take those actions. But where SOAR falls short is in the hard part of the investigative side of incident response that involves understanding what happened. Before I go reset creds or isolate a host, how do I know that's the right thing to do? How do I go and understand what happened, querying and analyzing evidence, understanding organizational context, even just being able to come up with a determination. Is this Is this a true positive? Do I need to go take these actions that my playbook is telling me? That's where SOAR has fallen short. And that's where, to our prior point, we think there's a promise of AI agents where we're able to do or perform far more complex investigative tasks, really emulate the investigative process that a expert incident responder or operations analyst would go through themselves as they're tasked with conducting an investigation, querying those systems, gathering data, and not being limited to just basic automations or basic actions.
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And the reason why I see that is because I've played with some SOAR platforms as well, right? Like the way I understand SOAR platforms is that you can basically integrate multiple services, right? Like there's Slack, there's Jira, and then based on your workflows, you can sort of call certain services and whatnot, right? So all that, the integration part is fine. But then, yeah, how do you decide when to trigger a workflow or not is where the I think the main problem is, right? Because more often than not, I remember when I was playing with a SOAR platform in one of my previous workplaces, yeah, we would constantly trigger alerts and workflows when there was no need. It was just kind of a bunch of false positives. And like you mentioned, there was alert fatigue and it was just too overwhelming for the entire team. And we had to shut the entire platform down because it wasn't providing us value. It was just adding more work on our plates. So that makes a lot of sense. And I'm very intrigued by the fact that we're using AI agents to sort of solve some of those reasoning, problems. And I think that is essentially what AI agents are meant to do, based on, again, my experience. So yeah, that's pretty fascinating. So if we need to draw parallels, right, with the SOC space, and then so let's say since I am more of an AppSec guy, right? So if I take AppSec domain, um, again, based on your familiarity with the AppSec space, what areas do you think, or do you have any like suggestions of like some of these areas that could be solved with AI agents, right, where it's just very difficult to reason and automate and a bunch of other things?
Yeah. I don't think there's a lot of difference between AppSec and other domains. I mean, take vulnerability as an example in areas that I'm very familiar with from my past life. I'm sure you're very familiar with, Anshuman. I'm sure you can, think about CVEs in your sleep. I certainly did for a long time. Take a very common scenario. I've been on the other side. You have as well. Alert fires. In this case, an alert is a CVE has been released. It's affecting one of your dependencies in your application. There is a process that I believe most engineers, AppSec engineers, would go through to understand. Okay, is it fixable? First of all, if it's not fixable, don't bother me, right? I don't need to know. Or is there a workaround for this? What is it impacting? Which application? Who owns that application or service? Is it in production? Is it touching PII or PCI? Like, there's some organizational context that's missing. If it is in production, is it being used? I don't know about you. I have plenty of dependencies that are unused. Is it used? Is it in memory? What code paths are touching, or is this a dependency touching? And so, it's really hard to just take a CVE and at face value determine, is this good or bad? I think it's no different than an alert that a SOC analyst or incident response engineer might deal with. The alert is just the beginning. And there's all these interesting questions which need to be asked, context around the organization that has to be gathered, sort of tribal knowledge, which for the most part is sitting between, your 2 years or my 2 years and it isn't codified anywhere. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for us to go and do something very similar to what we're doing today in security operations in AppSec, and say, hey, what do we do before I even bother a single human? There's all this homework which can be done. When I think of us being in grade school and doing math homework, I don't know if you remember this, we couldn't just write the answer, right? We had to show our work, go step by step before we got to the answer, and we get full credit for that problem. I don't think this is any different. Before we can ever go and bother, either an AppSec engineer or a operations engineer, I think there's a lot of homework which we need to go do. And in the AppSec case, it might be vulnerability based. In operations, it might be more of a runtime alert or a user alert. But really, I think fundamentally the process is the same.
No, I think that's right on, and I've been thinking about these problems as well. I think especially when it comes to vulnerabilities, right? So, like you mentioned, when a new CV comes out, it's basically a situation where everybody is in this chaotic mode, trying to figure out, right? Like so, and I think some of these problems, I think more than AI agents, it also sort of depends on how you do vulnerability management in the first place, right? Like, what are the systems you integrate? What does the process look like? What does the triaging process look like? So on and so forth. And bringing all of those systems together and, sort of building an agent that could interact with these different systems. And then based on the outcomes, it could decide what to do uh, next, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is essentially, I believe, the future of vulnerability management, at least, right? Because all the companies I've worked at so far, big and small, there's the one common problem I've seen is management, or sorry, the triaging of vulnerabilities in the first place is very difficult, right? And then the second problem I've seen is, you have all these like SaaS tools, dash tools, and all of these tools have so many findings, like thousands of findings, and it's just very difficult for any engineer to go into the dashboards and sort of triage in a meaningful way where you're actually spending, let's say I spend an hour, and in that hour I'm actually triaging vulnerabilities. Most of the time when I try to do that, I'm just so overwhelmed. I'm like, where do I even start?
Yeah.
Right. So I believe that, these are some problems where even vendors like SendRep and whatnot, right? Like they could start building AI agents to solve some of these problems, right? To make our the lives of AppSec and
Yeah.
operation engineers' life
I'm
easier,
sure
right?
I'm sure they are. I'm sure they are. I
Yeah,
don't think this is
yeah,
a very novel problem. The other thing I'll say, Anshuman, and you may know the history here better than I do, but my understanding is NVD, which is, the vulnerability database that
uh,
everyone uses, was never designed for this purpose, right? It's sort of, outgrown whatever its original intention was. And again, I could be wrong here. And I've certainly seen a lot of very ugly code that's been written to parse unstructured or semi-structured data is coming out of NVD. It's inconsistent at best. And it's another example, going back to our topic around agents, where, it's already such a mess. And I don't know, I certainly don't want to write all this Python code to parse that. I'm sure you don't either. And maybe that's an opportunity again for us to, use something a little more probabilistic, like an agent, and have that give us, some sort of context as to what is this vulnerability about? Where is it impacted? How should
yeah,
I think about that?
I know, absolutely. Um, okay, I have one more question in the AI space before we can sort of branch into other things. So, this concept of human in the loop, right? Like, look, we can't, or at least what I've seen and heard is we shouldn't be trusting the outcomes from AI completely. There has to be some kind of human element involved in the loop, right? So, how are you thinking about this problem with profit security? Like, do you have aspects of human approvals or, like things like that?
Totally. Yeah. In security, I think keeping the human in the loop is essential. While Profit AI can handle a lot of the triage, investigation, and response process, our customers are always in charge, and, they decide how much oversight they want to have. I think each
Uh,
customer is going to have, a different level of comfort with autonomy. So I think that is first and foremost. We talked a little bit about transparency already, and I think that's really been a key product tenet for us from day one. We're not trying to build an autonomous SOC. We're really trying to support our customers. We're trying to supercharge, the security analysts, engineers, incident responders who are looking at that wall of alerts and trying to figure out, what to do with it. And if we start with that basic premise, that basic product tenet, then I think we're in this trust building exercise with our customers.
uh,
We've built the system with explainability in mind. I gave you the example of math homework earlier. We have to show our work. If we don't, then no, I think, user or customer is going to trust the determinations that we come to. And so, our product, our AI agents, don't just provide conclusions, but they
uh,
also show their reasoning. To your previous point, they show the evidence. They show how the evidence was gathered, which data sources were leveraged, what the query was. Users can trust but verify our work if they want to double check the analysis that we performed. And so again, it's always around giving the analysts the information that they need to come to the right answer. So that's really how we think about it. And the last thing I'll say is, while there's a lot of discussion, rightfully so, around human in the loop, there's not enough discussion around feedback. I don't think any system is perfect, ourselves included. And so we've consciously or explicitly designed the system so that we can learn from user feedback. And I think security is a great example where there's all this tribal knowledge sitting in people's heads and isn't codified anywhere, isn't in run books, or isn't documented. So we make it really easy for analysts, engineers, incident responders to give us feedback around the actions that our AI agents took, the overall conclusions that we came to. And this feedback directly informs future investigations. It allows us to learn from the feedback, learn more about different organizations, continuously improve, and really make sure that the system becomes custom fit or tailored to each organization. There's a feedback element to the human in the loop as well that I don't think is talked about as much as the oversight.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, because if you're not sort of if you don't have this constant feedback loop, right, like where you take the outcomes from whatever you're doing and then you improve upon it, which means you could either train your models with that data, or you use those as test cases to provide as input. I think it's a good point. And
I was thinking,
go ahead.
All right, go ahead.
Please go ahead.
No, speaking to one of our customers a few months ago, and they were without naming names, they were dissatisfied with their CNAP, and they were actually using this as an example where the CNAP was generating a bunch of alerts that weren't relevant to their organization, and there was they even shared their screen on Zoom and showed me there was an ability to give feedback, and they would try to suppress these alerts or something, and it just from their perspective, it just went to dev null. It didn't go anywhere, right? That feedback wasn't utilized. So that's incredibly frustrating from a customer or user perspective to deal with something like that. So if you don't feel like the system is learning from your input, your actions, I think you'll end up being dissatisfied very, very quickly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, cool. So we have some more time. So I would love to sort of branch slightly into more of the startup world. This is your fourth company that you've co-founded, and you're the CTO of. What has this startup journey been like for you? What have you learned, and how do you decide whether it's the right time to basically start a new company versus continue doing what you've been doing?
Yeah.
Any thoughts around this that you can share?
Oh man, it's hard, Anshuman. I feel like I know less than I did, not more. I think I'll say a couple of things, and both of these will probably sound trite, but I think first is just the value and importance of people and team. You're in the trenches with these folks 60, 80 hours a week, and if these are not folks whom you trust and respect, folks you can learn from, folks you enjoy working with, I think it's going to be really, really hard. I think that's a lesson I've learned, time and time again. I've also optimized for this. I've always made sure that I've picked the right people, the right team over name brands and titles and other things. It applies not only for your, co-founders and founding team, but also applies equally for your investors and, anyone else who you bring on board this journey. And I just don't think we can emphasize enough the importance of the caliber of your team, the integrity of your team. If you get that wrong, I find it very, very hard to get anything else right. It always starts with people. We're in the people business, and I think making sure you surround yourself with the right people is important. That being said, I don't think the team is a guarantor of success. It's probably a prerequisite of success. And I'm butchering this, but this is probably an old Andy Ratcliffe saying around great teams meeting bad markets end up with bad results, and you have okay teams intersecting with great markets, and you end up with great results. Again, I might be butchering that or paraphrasing that incorrectly, but I've learned the lesson the hard way around the importance of markets and really making sure that you're tackling not only a big market, which everyone talks about, and we can argue about big today versus big 5 years or 10 years from now, and so there is a growth trajectory, but it's also understanding the current state of the market, right? You have to understand, is the market ready for a product like yours? Is the market ready for what you're selling? You talked a little bit about skepticism earlier, certainly in the market we're in. By no means do I think it's insurmountable, but you have to understand that, hey, this is a headwind that you're facing. And, folks have been sold snake oil before, and they're not going to fall for it a second time. So understanding market dynamics, understanding, what type of market is this? Just as an example, in my personal experience, we started a container security company in 2013. We were probably too early to that market. And, that was very early. Docker wasn't even 1.0. Kubernetes did not exist. In the subsequent, I think, 4 or 5 years, we had what I call the orchestrator wars. There was Kube and Swarm and Mesos and Yarn and I think Marathon from HashiCorp. There were just all these orchestrators that we don't talk about anymore. But we went through this whole process of containerization and what does that mean from an orchestration perspective. So we were just too early. And I think Howard Marks says, being too early is indistinguishable from being wrong. And I often think about that or share that anecdote, which is, you have to understand market dynamics in addition to team dynamics for a winning combination.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So do you feel like what happened with the container sort of world, right? Like you mentioned, there was a bunch of frameworks and whatnot. Do you feel like same thing is happening with AI agents right now?
To a degree, yes. I think to a degree, yes. I think the hype is certainly there. I don't think there was as much hype on like orchestrators. I think I call them the orchestrator wars because everyone knew that an individual container was a building block from an infrastructure perspective, but was insufficient, right? You didn't just deploy individual containers, although I recall some customers started that way, but you really were deploying applications or a distributed application which needed orchestration to a degree. So that was more of a necessity in some ways. Someone was going to win those wars. With AI agents, it's a little bit different, right? I think it's more of this potential that all of us see. And, there's this explosion of opportunity trying to capture that potential. There, as you said earlier, all these unknowns about how we're going to do this and what's the right application for agents, where can they be trusted, where does the human need to step in. So I feel like we're far more early in the journey with agents, and this is maybe a little bit before my time, Anshuman, but I can't help but think of the sort of dot-com boom where we knew the internet was going to change the world, but 25 or 30 years ago, I'm not sure anyone could have predicted everything that we've seen over the course of the past few decades.
Yeah. Right on. Okay, awesome. Well, I think that was a good end. We spoke quite a bit about AI agents and agentic frameworks and security problems. And I'm excited for the future. I'm excited to see what you folks are doing at Profit Security. And, so if you end up, finding or solving interesting security challenges, please do share that knowledge forward, because I think the industry at large needs more companies like Profit Security to come and sort of build things and also share about how they're building. So I'm personally very excited about the future here. And again, thank you so much, Vibhav, for coming onto the show and sharing all your experience and everything else. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully I'll be back in a year or so, and we can catch up on the state of AI agents in 2025.
That would be nice. Yeah, state of AI agents 2025, and we kind of redo it. Yeah, that sounds exciting.
Awesome. We'll put it on the calendar.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yes, sir. Okay. Thank you, Vibhav.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Jubba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.